So, good evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all here. Some of us are regular Tuesday at 7ers. We've got a series of 4 for January. Last week, some of us shared poems and other items to do with New Year and new things. And then, as you know, this week is on Luke's Gospel. Next week is a quiz, and the week after is me doing a talk. But whether you're here just for this evening or whether you're a regular, that's fine. Everybody's welcome. I was just hesitating because a message has come up telling me I'm signed out because I'm on another device. Is anybody signed in as me? Now I can't see anybody else signed in as me, so hopefully it's okay. What I'm thinking of doing is having a little time to start with, just as a sort of icebreaker. Then I've got a basic introduction to Luke's Gospel. Rosemary, it doesn't matter if I say anything that you are also going to say, because if we say it 2 or 3 times, it doesn't matter. We all want to take it in. So I'll do a basic introduction, and then Rosemary's going to talk to us. Now, is anyone else knowledgeable about Luke's Gospel who would like a little slot? I'm not expecting anyone to put their hands up. Cliff's not here, so I can't ask him. Okay, well, we'll hear what Rosemary says, and then I've got some more information and some slides to share with you. And any PowerPoint slides that I do share, I'm happy to send to anybody afterwards. So if you feel you'd like them for reference later, I can certainly let you have them. And then depending how the time goes, maybe we will look at a passage from Luke's Gospel and see what it says to us, particularly in the light of any information we're going to hear. So to start off, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm not inviting you to speak at the moment. I just want you to think of the answers. If you're with somebody else, obviously you can discuss it with them. The question is this: how do you know at the moment what's going on in the world? Or how do you know what's going on in another part of the country? Or how do you know what's going on with your family and friends who don't live near you? Just think of possible answers to that question. How do you know what's going on? Okay, how many of you thought of newspapers? Hands up. Yes, most people thought of newspapers. How many people thought of the internet? Yes? Oh, I think that's everybody. How many people thought of mobile phones? Yeah, quite a lot of people. Jen said WhatsApp to me, and I'd forgotten about WhatsApp, but mobile phones includes text messages, WhatsApp, hearing people on the phone. Then how many people thought of television? Again, quite a lot. And what about radio? Okay, so we've got all these ways, and of course we could receive a letter. Heather, did you want to speak, or did you think of a letter? Yeah, you thought of a letter. okay, we've got all these ways of finding out in our day and age what's going on. And as we know, we're in fact bombarded with information, and something happens over the other side of the world, like Novak Djokovic is in trouble in Australia, and we know about it more or less the instant it happens. At least if we want to know about it, we do. So let's go back to the 1st century AD and the world of Jesus' time in Palestine and the decades thereafter. What on earth was that like? They didn't have newspapers, they didn't have the internet, they didn't have mobile phones, they didn't have television, and they didn't have radio. How did they know what was going on? If something was happening in the Roman Empire of massive importance, how did they know? If Jesus, an amazing new person on the scene, had fed 5,000 people, how do other people find that out? Well, obviously, they only had the word of mouth. One shall tell another, and another shall tell their friend. The news spread. And news of an important nature that people wanted to remember got put into little packages, little stories, so that people remembered the stories. And I was reading this week, a commentator was saying that there would have been the recognized storytellers in each little community who were good at telling the stories and who would frame the stories in a certain way, so that if somebody told the story in a different way and tried to sort of reframe it, they'd all be told, no, that's not right. This is the story. It got remembered as a sort of package, and then it got passed on from generation to generation. So Luke, who we'll talk about in a minute, he'd never met Jesus, and yet he could meet the people and meet the storytellers who held the memories, who held the stories. And we can imagine him traveling around, collecting stories that he then put into the book he was writing. So I'm just going to show a few slides to start with. And as I say, it doesn't matter if I steal Rosemary's thunder. I've got Cliff come on now. Cliff, did you want to say anything this evening, or are you just going to listen? I can't hear you because you're muted. Yeah, you're still muted. Can we hear you now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. Did you want to contribute, Cliff, this evening on Luke's Gospel?
No, I will just say something when I feel like I want to talk, because I've talked a lot, so I am having both the headache and some aches at the moment.
Okay, you're not feeling so good, are you, because of your tooth and headaches and everything?
Yes.
Okay, but thanks for being here. Right, I'm going to share my screen with a few basic facts about Luke and his Gospel. So this is a basic fact. Luke wrote the longest Gospel that we have. It's 24 chapters, and it's longer than Matthew, Mark and John. And in fact, of course, he wrote Acts as well. It was a two-part work. And the length of both those books makes him the most prolific New Testament writer. So from that point of view alone, his work is a very important part of the New Testament. As we're going to say again and again, I think, during this hour, Luke was a Gentile. He was not a Jew, and he would not have met Jesus. But as I've just been saying, he met those who had met Jesus, and he would have listened to their stories. Of course, he also had other written material probably available to him, but we'll think about that later as well. And it's believed that he was the doctor who gets mentioned in Acts, who sometimes travelled with Paul. Now, I need 3 people with a Bible. Let me stop sharing for the moment. Could 3 people get a Bible and look up a Bible reference? So I can see Pippa with one. Who else will do that? John Hull looks as though he's got a Bible. And Shirley Stephen. So let's go back to my references. Who did I say? Pippa, John and Shirley. So Pippa, could you look up Colossians 4 verse 14? John and Wendy, could you look up 2 Timothy 4 verse 11? And Philemon, which is only a very, very short book. Shirley, could you look at verse 24 of that? So these are the 3 references that we have to Luke in the rest of the New Testament. And it's from those 3 references that people have worked out who he is. So, Pippa, did I just ask you to do Colossians?
You did.
Yeah. Tell us what that verse says.
It says, Luke, our dear doctor, and Demas send you their greetings.
So that tells us that the writer of, it was Colossians, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The writer of Colossians, which we believe to be St. Paul, Luke was a dear friend of his. And it also tells us that he was a doctor. So, John and Wendy, could you give us the 2 Timothy reference?
Luke is with me. Bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry.
Thank you. So that's Paul again, and he says that Luke is with him. And it's believed that Luke was on some of Paul's missionary journeys with him. And Shirley, the last reference, Philemon.
And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas and Luke, my fellow workers.
Okay, thanks. So there Luke again is a fellow worker. So they're the 3 references from Paul's letters, and other information comes from what Luke himself wrote in Acts of the Apostles. Just to put a bit of visual imagery on all this, does anyone know what, do you immediately know what the symbol of St. Luke is? Anybody? Is anyone admitting to it? Nobody's putting their hand up. Pippa, do you know? Pippa knows all the quick questions.
Is it a snake round a crozier or something?
No. Okay, I'll put you out of your misery and just go back to my screen. It's a winged ox. And I had forgotten that. I remember that John is an eagle, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you before this week what Luke was. but he's a winged ox, and there's a very simple representation of him. Here's a much more colourful and dramatic winged ox in a stained glass window. And I love this one. Look at those wings. I think that's amazing. And the last picture I've got here is a picture of St. Luke and the gospel that he's writing and the ox. And this is all from a church in Venice. So we'll leave the slides for the moment. And I'm going to go over to, oh, Rosemary's showing us. Rosemary, I'm going to highlight you and come to you now. So I'm just going to spotlight you. And I think you're showing us a commentary there.
Well, it's the winged ox.
Yes, it's on a commentary though, isn't it?
That's the cared commentary.
Ah, yes, yes. Right, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, you said some of the things, but I think one of the things to remember when we're dealing with any of these ancient documents is that they're 2,000 years old. And it's amazing how much we can gather, how much we can sort of feel we know, but some of it is still a bit sort of speculative. So it's thought that the gospel was written by Luke, and it is generally believed because of the evidence that he was a Gentile. One or two of the commentaries think that he was a second generation Christian. You know, he didn't become a Christian. He was brought up probably in a Christian family, is what they're saying. And he was obviously a thoughtful, educated, cultured gentleman. And when he wanted to put together a detailed, well-researched account of Jesus's life, he was really well equipped to do it. He was a scholarly man, a historian, educated, and he does write very well. And he wanted to write an account of the story of Jesus's life, and of course the birth of the church, which is why he wrote the sequel of the Acts of the Apostles. They reckon that the gospel was probably written in Rome. There is debate about this. Some people think it was between 65 and 70 AD, and some think it was between 80 and 85 AD. So you pays your money and takes your choice. I don't know. And it was to be sent to, when he was writing it, for Theophilus, who it is thought was a high-ranking Roman official. Maybe he was Luke's sponsor, you know, something to do with Luke's position. Whatever it was, he was obviously a person of some importance, and Luke wants to get it all right for him. He wants to have an accurate account, and of course Acts also is written for him. Luke places Jesus and what follows firmly in the center of Judaism and Rome, and as a Gentile, he doesn't overemphasize the Jewish parts of Jesus. He wants to make it much more general. He's an historian, and he presents a very scholarly account. I think he really writes rather well. I think he's probably a bit like Tony. He was a classical scholar. He did Greek and Latin. And he goes to the heart of Jesus' message. And the heart of it, from Luke's point of view, is it's for the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized. And this is what comes out strongly in his story of what Jesus says and does. For example, he makes a special point of Jesus' relationship with tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, thieves, the undesirable. And from my point of view, and this doesn't come out because nearly all the scholars are men, but I think he's absolutely wonderful about women. For example, the Magnificat, he reports what Mary has to say in her visit to Elizabeth and so forth. He starts with a peasant girl, a teenage peasant girl, a working man, and the two women, Mary and Elizabeth, and their joyous conversation when they meet together. And he's the only one who does that. And then getting the message over to each other about their babies is very much a feminine conversation. They're both excited about these babies that they're going to have. these rather strange and wonderful births. One, a woman too old really to have a baby, and she's having one, and Mary, who's not married, and they're talking about their situations, very feminine, two women together, getting the message about their babies. And then, of course, I put this in the thought for the week on the link today, but I think it's very significant that the census was set up. Have you ever thought of this, that God needed to get Mary safely out of Nazareth, because had she remained while her pregnancy was developing, the people of Nazareth might have twigged that actually this baby had begun before she was married, and therefore she was very liable to be stoned to death. So God neatly arranges the emperor, the Roman emperor, to organize a census to get Mary safely out of Nazareth and on the way to Bethlehem. I don't think it's the least bit improbable that's what God did, to get Mary safely to Bethlehem, which is what happens. So she's out of danger. Then the elderly. Again, this is Luke's sensitivity. I love Luke. The sensitivity that it's Simeon, dear old faithful Simeon, and the old widow Anna, who lives in the temple, having been a widow most of her life. And they're the ones, again, who recognize Jesus. This is only in Luke. Incredible sensitivity. They recognize the baby when he's brought to the temple. And, Simeon, of course, as we know, says his lovely Nunc Dimittis. And then I get the significance of John the Baptist. And there's a lot. I mean, you can go through the gospel and pick out all sorts of things, but I'm only going to do a little short introduction. For me, and this has been so for a long time, I think the most significant story in Luke, and one which totally endears him to me, is the story of Jairus and Jesus in a crowd, and this ruler of the synagogue doesn't bother about his status and his position in society. He's desperate, and he's not desperate about a precious son. Don't forget it was sons everyone wanted. He's desperate about a deeply loved daughter. He wants his little girl to get better, and she's dying. And so he forgets his position and comes to Jesus begging for help, anything that might help his beloved little girl. And Jesus immediately starts off to go with him. But meanwhile, just behind Jesus is an equally desperate woman. She's had this chronic hemorrhage. I remember asking my husband what she'd got wrong, and he gave me the name, but of course I've forgotten it. It was a medical term. I'm sure Glyn would be able to fill it in for us. He knows about these things. But she had a condition that women can get where they more or less have a constant period. It just never stops. So this wretched woman, not only was she anemic, she was losing blood all the time, but she was also, of course, unclean. Now, we're talking about women. Jairus' daughter is 12. This woman has been bleeding for 12 years. I think there's significance in this. A boy coming up to 12 years old would be coming to be made a full Israelite. He would be being received. For the girls, there was nothing. There is now, but there wasn't then. A girl was totally insignificant. All she would ever be able to do to make her significant was marry and have sons. So this 12 is quite important. This child is coming up to 12, or is 12, but she's not going to become a full Israelite because she's only a girl. And this woman who's been bleeding has been outcast for 12 years. No one can touch her. She cannot touch anything without making it unclean. Two pretty awful situations. So the girl is not going to become a full citizen, and the woman is going to remain an outcast. And it is to this world of women's plights that Jesus comes. And Jesus heals the woman. She becomes clean and can now be once again a member of society. And then he goes to Jairus' home, where he meets all the people wailing because the child has died. And he goes in and says really to the little girl, come on, little girl, it's time to get up. It's time to become a real person. It's time to grow up. I think those two stories are absolutely wonderful for women. And I think it's Luke that puts women right back in the picture where they belong. Maybe it's because he's a doctor, I don't know, but I think it's absolutely wonderful that he presents women with such importance, and indeed the other Gospels do this at the resurrection, but with him, the women are the first witnesses to the resurrection, the first apostles to the apostles. So it's presumed he was a Gentile, but he was also, of course, well versed in Jewish history and in the Greek Old Testament. He obviously knew all that very well indeed. They reckon he was probably a native of Antioch and a second generation Christian. But for me, he is the one who puts the unrespectable, the outcasts, into position. And I think for me, that story of Jairus's daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage absolutely sums him up. I think that's the wonderful center to his gospel. And so that's what I always like to dwell on when I think of Luke, who I must say I do admire very much.
Rosemary, thank you. I'll take the spotlight off you. And I've got everyone back on my screen anyway. Good to see you all still there. Thanks, Rosemary. That's really helpful. I've got a few more slides which will affirm again some of those things Rosemary's been saying, but some other things as well. So I'll just go back to my screen, back to that image. Now this is an interesting slide because it shows how all the synoptic gospel writers, that is to say Matthew, Mark and Luke, it shows how they're connected. So the purple bits are what they all share in common. So Mark's gospel shares 76% of the gospel with Matthew and Luke. Matthew shares 46% with the other two and Luke 41%. But the interesting figure is what's unique to each gospel. Unique to Mark is only 3%. Unique to Matthew is 20%. Unique to Luke is 35%. So there's quite a lot of Luke that only he tells us. And he therefore got that material from other sources. And as I was suggesting right at the beginning, maybe those sources were stories that had been kept alive. Oh, another interesting thing is that one reason why he may have written things down, and the other gospel writers too, 30 or 40 years after Jesus had died, one reason for the urgency to do that might have been that people were dying out, and also the disturbance in the Roman Empire as the Jews had rebelled against the Romans. And there might have been a real danger that other stories would have been lost. And so that's probably why you get the gospel writers at different times, but still decades after Jesus' death, writing things down. So it's also interesting that Luke and Matthew share some material, and so do Mark and Luke, and so do Mark and Matthew. So I think that's a really, it's a really helpful slide. Now the next one I found from somewhere is the structure of Luke's gospel. I'll just talk you through this. So on the right, we've got a map with Galilee at the top, Samaria in the middle and Judea at the bottom. And of course, it was Galilee and Judea that were the Jewish countries by this time, by the time of Jesus. Samaria was not Jewish because of the history and everything that had happened in the Old Testament. So this structure on the left shows in green, chapters 1 to 3, preparing for, as it says it there, the Lord's coming. Now, chapters 1 and 2, of course, are the birth narratives. Chapter 3 is John the Baptist and his preparation. So those things happened in different places. So it's not got a little line. Of course, the birth happened in Bethlehem, which is down in Judea. Then in yellow, there's chapters 4 to 9, and that's the mission in Galilee. So chapters 4 to 9 take place in Galilee, and it's in yellow, and Galilee's in yellow at the top there. And then in a sort of orange, chapters 10 to 19 is when Jesus is travelling towards Jerusalem, and a lot of that happens in Samaria and in Perea, which is that area to the right of the Jordan River. So the early part is in Galilee, then we get Jesus travelling through Samaria and Perea, and then in the last part of the book, chapters 19 to 24, you've got Jesus coming to Jerusalem and everything that happened there, and of course the crucifixion and the resurrection. So again, that's a helpful slide, and when we go through the lectionary year, and a lot of the readings this year are from Luke's Gospel, although some are from John's Gospel, because poor old John doesn't have a year to himself, and he has to fit in the other years. So some of the readings this year are from John, but most of them are from Luke, and in the season that's known as ordinary time, which we're in at the minute, it goes chronologically through. When we get to Lent and Easter, then of course the readings are about those events. And then once you get past Pentecost and Trinity Sunday, it goes back to ordinary time and the chronological going through the Gospel. Now, I thought I'd just show you something I did some years ago that just lists various characteristics, and Rosemary's already told us about most of these. Those first 4 characteristics are all to fit in with the letters of Luke. Love, the fact that it's a human, compassionate gospel, and God's love gets talked about over and over again. The U is for universal, and the fact that God's love is for everyone, including and especially women, children, the poor, everybody that's looked down upon by everybody else. And it's not just people in general. So the K is knowledge of individuals. Luke tells us stories of actual individuals, actual women, actual poor people, actual looked down upon people. Children, it's more in general, although there's that 12-year-old girl, as Rosemary's already said. And then there's the E for experiencing salvation or healing, and there's a lot about both those words in Luke's Gospel, but interestingly there's only one Greek word. So people who translate it have to decide whether to translate it salvation or saving, or whether they translate it healing or being healed. In the Greek, it's all the same, that if you are healed, you are saved, and if you're saved, you're healed. And the fact that Luke was a doctor, which we know from the reference we've already looked at, it's obviously really important to him that people are healed and or that people are saved. And then there's these 6 P's. It's interesting that Luke mentions peace more than any of the other gospel writers. Praise resounds throughout the gospel. Prayer, he records 7 prayers, as well as teaching about prayer. The passion of Christ, the cross, is important as it is in all the gospels, but for Luke it's the ultimate expression of salvation by faith in Jesus Christ. Purpose, God has a plan, and that continues in the story of Acts. And power of the Holy Spirit, a spirit which comes more to the fore in the Acts of the Apostles, but it's there from the beginning of Luke's Gospel as well. You can't really separate the 2 books. They're all one story. And then I just found some quotes here. Whoops, how did that happen? The first 2 quotes are by the same person, a commentator called Michael Wilcox. Actually, Jen, could you read this? If I read the first one, can you read the second one for me so it's not my voice all the time? What cannot be denied is that this gospel is thoroughly Gentile in its spirit and outlook. The so-called Gentile mission, the spread of the good news beyond the bounds of the Israelite nation, is a major theme both in the gospel and in Acts. But, and this is interesting, the 2 books are themselves an integral part of that mission and an instrument of it. In an age when many in the church were still very conscious of their Jewish roots, it is striking that this spacious and beautiful work should have been produced by a Gentile for Gentiles. And then the same person wrote this. Jen will read it.
On Luke as showing that gospel is for everyone. Luke is depicting many classes of people. The gospel is not only for Jews, but also for Greeks, and for Romans and Samaritans too. It is not only for males, but also for females, and not simply important women like the wife of Herod's steward, but widows and cripples and prostitutes as well. It is not only for freemen, but also for slaves, and indeed for all whom society despises, for the poor, the weak and the outcast, for the thief and the ghizzling. And all of these Luke delights to show as particular individuals. A galaxy of such portraits glitters across his 24 chapters. These are real people, and among them the human condition is really to be found.
Thank you. And then I'll just read this 3rd one. And then I want us to share a bit together. The 3rd quote is, Luke sees the divine purpose as intimately bound up with the love and mercy of God. A feature of this gospel is the way God's love is portrayed as active in a variety of ways and among a variety of people. This is not an occasional theme, but one which runs through the whole writing. It is perhaps this that gives to the 3rd gospel its peculiar attractiveness. The writer was obviously a man of culture with an appreciation of the beautiful, and he could write well. But it is not any or all of these that accounts for the beauty of this writing. Rather, it is the way the love of God shines through in parable and saying and story of Jesus. As we come towards the end, I'm going to ask you what stories are only in Luke's Gospel. Oh, Glyn, are you going to suggest?
Yeah, I think if we didn't have Luke's Gospel, then we wouldn't really have Christmas.
No, that's absolutely true.
So I think that's a, you know, there's nothing in Mark, nothing in John, 6 verses in Matthew, and the story of the wise men, which does appear in Matthew and nowhere else, completely in Luke's Gospel.
Yep, thank you. Those birth narratives, the first 2 chapters are only in Luke. Dee, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I think I'm right. In saying that the prodigal son is only in. I think.
Yes, you are right. You are right. The prodigal son is only in Luke. Sarah.
Is the Good Samaritan only in Luke?
Yeah, I'm just checking my list here because I don't want to lead anybody astray. But I'm sure it is. Yes, the Good Samaritan. Yes, and of course that's a story about an outsider who actually wins the day. So illustrates the point about Luke's emphasis on that. So yes, so we've got the birth narratives, we've got the Good Samaritan, we've got the prodigal son. Anyone think of anything else that's only in Luke? Or that you think is only in Luke? Glyn, another one?
I think he's the only one that talks about woes with blessings. So whereas the Beatitudes in Matthew go, say, blessed are, blessed are, blessed are, Luke's got them, but then it says woe is, woe to you, woe to somebody else, and a series of woes afterwards.
Yeah, you're right. And I think the Beatitudes are shorter in Luke, aren't they? I think, possibly. Well, the Sermon on the Mount is shorter, and isn't it called the Sermon on the Plain? But I'm just speaking out of memory. Okay, well, I've got a list of the material that's only in Luke. So we'll have a look at that. Just move this slide on. Of the narrative or story episodes, there's the entire infancy narrative. Then there's all these other ones. Miraculous draught of fish, the widow's son who was raised from the dead, the woman who bathes Jesus' feet with her tears, the women who accompany Jesus, there's the emphasis on the women again, sending out of the 72 disciples, that wider group, Martha and Mary. If we didn't have Luke, we wouldn't have Martha and Mary. We would have them in John's Gospel, but not like they are in Luke's Gospel. Then the healing of a crippled woman on the Sabbath, the healing of a man with dropsy, the Samaritan leper. I'm just hesitating. Is that the 10 lepers?
That's a separate one.
That's a separate one. Okay. There's Zacchaeus, Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, Jesus before Herod, meeting with daughters of Jerusalem as he is taken to his crucifixion, the good and the bad thieves beside him on the cross, and the appearance on the road to Emmaus as part of the resurrection appearances. So all that is only in Luke, and we must be very grateful to him for that. But then there's the parables and the teachings, parables that are only in Luke, the Good Samaritan, the I don't know what that one is, I'll have to look it up, importunate friend, the rich man who builds bigger barns, transformation of the fig tree. No, it's a parable in Luke. It's transformation in Mark and Matthew. The prodigal son, the crafty steward, the rich man and Lazarus, the unscrupulous judge, the publican and the sinner who are praying. And there's a few teachings that are only in Luke as are listed there. I just want to mention one more thing that's in all the Gospels, and that's the phrase, the Son of Man. Now, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, and it's used in Matthew 30 times, so it's particularly used. I've got that, this is wrong, my slides, because in Luke it's 25 times. I've typed it wrong. In Matthew it's 30 times, in Mark 15, in Luke 25, and in John 12. So it's quite a prominent thing in Luke's Gospel, Jesus talking about himself as the Son of Man. And people have different theories as to what it means and where it's come from, and whether it refers to Jesus' humanity or to his divinity. But there's a general consensus that it's a phrase in the Old Testament that's often used or used significantly in terms of the Messiah, the person that they're waiting for. And so it seems quite likely that when Jesus used it, it was his phrase for knowing that he himself was fulfilling the prophecies of Messiahship. Okay, we've got another 10 minutes or so. Just going to come back to you. Make sure you're all still there. Oh, yes, you are. Good. Just for this last 10 minutes, let's look at an actual passage. It's the story of Zacchaeus. If I put it up on the screen, is there somebody who would read it for us that's not me or Jen? Read it from the screen with being unmuted. Kay, will you do that? Can you unmute yourself, Kay? I'm going to ask you to unmute, then you just need to click. Yeah, you've done it. Right, so I'll get it up on the screen, and then if you like to read it. Okay.
It's a little difficult because the pictures of everybody take out the ends of the passage.
Oh, yes, you can actually move them. Would you rather somebody else read it?
No, but if you can move them, it'll make more sense, I think.
Are you going to read it to us?
Yes, I will. Grant's just moving.
Oh, right, okay.
No,
wrong one. Make it just down to a single line, and then that's easier to move.
No, I've got it's gone small now. How do I
Press on the minus.
I'm here.
Oh yeah, there we go.
There we go. It's just there. That's fine. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost.
Thank you, thank you. Now, I'm just going to ask everybody for any reflections on that passage, either based on the things we've been saying or on anything else. Now, there's some obvious things arising from what we've been saying, but it'd be good to share the obvious things and the less obvious. So I'm going to take the screen away. Anybody like to just, if we were in a room together, we would just call them all out quickly, but it's a bit more difficult when we have to unmute. But anyone like to say anything? Anne?
Well, he was a tax collector, so he, first of all, that strikes you because he wouldn't be very well liked.
Yes, thank you. So it's an example of one of the least popular members of society being given prominence.
Yeah.
And as we noted already, this story is only in Luke's Gospel. Okay, great, thanks. Anything else from anybody? Jen and then Heather.
Well, the word salvation is used at the end, which is what you were talking about.
Yes, the end result is salvation, and as we've noted, the Greek word is the same for salvation and healing. So you could read it, healing has come to this house. Heather?
Well, just that Jesus knew who he was. He'd never met him. And
Yes.
he come down Zacchaeus, didn't he? He
I
knew
called him by name.
And what he was.
Yeah. And it illustrates that point that particular individuals are named and talked about. Rosemary?
It's interesting. It's interesting because the word that Jen had in the bit she read was quisling. Now, you're too young, most of you. But in the war, I think it was in Norway, there was a man who helped the Germans. You know, he worked with the Nazis, and his name was quisling. And it became a word for people who betrayed their own people and worked for the enemy. And of course, that's really what Zacchaeus was. He was a quisling. So he would be particularly hated by people because he was working for the foreign power.
Rosemary, thank you for explaining that. I didn't know what a quisling was.
You're too young.
Dee?
I just think that Zacchaeus obviously had heard about Jesus, and he was so desperate to see him, even though he knew people hated him and everything, that his desperation shows in that story to see Jesus and to find out more about him.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anne Thorpe again.
Just the fact that he's short, it mentions that he's short in stature, and that goes with what we were saying about all kinds of different people.
Yes, separately from the fact that he was a tax collector, he was also short. That must be an encouragement, mustn't it, to people who are short in stature? I've never thought of that before.
Sandra's nodding.
Sandra's nodding. Oh dear. Glyn.
I find it quite amazing that just seeing Jesus and Jesus saying that to him, he gave away half his possessions, and he was offering to pay back, the maximum amount, I think, that came from the Old Testament in the law if you'd stolen something from somebody. But just actually meeting Jesus and Jesus having said that to him, without anything else, he's prepared to give away half his fortune, which is quite surprising, really.
Yeah, it is amazing. Yeah, I was just thinking something else. Yes, of course, there's the emphasis on the poor there as well, on Zacchaeus as a tax collector and therefore outcast, but also the poor who have been cheated. Rosemary?
It's just this business of acceptance. Jesus accepted him. One of the things we do with people who've done something wrong, and this is where prisoners suffer a lot, is that they're condemned and despised and they're not accepted, and very often then go back to crime. If they can find friends to be accepted, to be received, and not to feel they're outcast, it completely changes their idea of the world and where they stand in it, and makes it much, much more possible for them to become part of the community. It's a very, very important thing. Jesus accepted Zacchaeus publicly, and that made a huge difference to the way he felt about himself and the way he behaved towards other people.
Thank you. We're nearly up to time. I'm just going to put that passage back on the screen for you again, because I want to just draw attention to the last verse. If one had to choose a key verse in Luke's Gospel, then this would be a very good candidate. Luke 19, verse 10. for the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. It's in this story of Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus is being given as an example, but you could apply this to the whole gospel. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Well, that passage, Luke 19, comes in the lectionary later in the year. As I said, the lectionary moves chronologically through the ordinary times, and so Luke 19 is much later in the year. But if any of us are leading worship on the day that Luke 19 comes, we'll have to look back at this recording and remind ourselves about Zacchaeus. Just to finish off, I've got a collect for St. Luke's Day, and apparently St. Luke's Day is October the 18th, so that's later in the year as well. I'm going to put the collect up on the screen, and we'll say it in our mutedness. So I'm just going to mute again Kay and Rosemary, unless she gets there first. Yes. I think everybody else is muted. So I'll put it up and we'll say it together. Collect for St. Luke's Day. Almighty God, you called Luke the physician, whose praise is in the gospel, to be an evangelist and physician of the soul. By the grace of the Spirit and through the wholesome medicine of the gospel, give your church the same love and power to heal, through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So thank you everyone for being here and for sharing, either just with your presence or by contributing. And when we've got the recording converted, we'll put it on the circuit website under the Tuesday at 7 link, so people can watch it again. And as I offered earlier, if anyone would like the PowerPoint slides, then let me know and I'll send them to you. And as I've already said, next week we're having a quiz that Pippa is organising, so therefore it will be very good. And hope to see some of you then. Oh, Aileen must have gone because I just admit her again, but I'm just about to say goodbye to everybody. Okay. So, Aileen, you disappeared, but now you're back again. Anyway, we're just about to say goodbye. So we're going to say goodbye in the traditional manner. Lots of waving. Bye, everybody.